For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Sashni Wali. Joining me today is Wits senior researcher Dineo Skosana, here to discuss her book, No Last Place to Rest, Coal Mining and Dispossession in South Africa. Can you tell us what the motivation behind No Last Place to Rest was? Was there a gap that you felt needed to be filled in the literature on mining and land dispossession in South Africa?
So I've worked in this area since 2013. And my PhD was on mining and grave relocations. And out of that PhD actually emerged a comment from William Bennett. He's a professor in Oxford. He was one of the examiners. And what he said was that it would be interesting to connect the question around ancestral graves to land. Often we think these are interconnected, which they are, but we don't always sort of flag the relationship between the two. And so then I did think that going forward with this work, it would be important to also tell the stories of the living and also connect it to those who have lost their ancestral graves. So that's how basically the motivation to then think about dispossession more broadly came about.
And in the book, you describe coal mining as South Africa's paradox. Can you just unpack that for us?
It is South Africa's paradox because 85% of our energy system is basically generated from coal mining and coal burning. And we have about 127 coal mines in South Africa. And this has been, our energy system historically, even though we're talking about shifting. So coal is actually essential in as much as it contributes to the carbon emissions and climate change, and as a result we've signed the Paris Agreement in 2015 to transition. And so it's a paradox because you have this mineral that you need, but at the same time it's having dire effects, as you would have seen in the book. Dispossessing communities, but also creating to other kinds of problems, health related, water, pollution to the environment and so on. So that's the compromise I think that we as South Africans, but not all, it's some, actually have to make in order for us to have ongoing power.
Now your book emphasizes ancestral graves and spiritual ties to land. Why was it important for you to center this aspect in a conversation that's often dominated by economics and policy?
It was very important because, so first it emerged scientifically, through research. But what was interesting is that when I started doing my research in the Mpumalanga area, communities often cited how the relocations of their ancestral graves was a process of erasure, and how they were using those ancestral graves to make claims to the land. So in South Africa's land reform project, they will then use the graves as evidence. And so then what it illustrated is how the grave question ties to questions around land. And I also started seeing the connections between the two, and how historically, if you look at the literature in South Africa, but also elsewhere, where there's reflections around dispossession, the forced removals, for example, in the 1960s, 70s, and so on, they don't make connections. So that we only focus on dispossession as the loss of land, which is it's accurate, but we don't think about what else is lost in the process. And I think that's what I was trying to show with the story around ancestral grave relocations, to show how that's an aspect of loss that hasn't been covered, and also to show that loss is actually multi-layered. So it's not just the loss of that material thing, but also intangible connections.
And your book also argues that dispossession didn't end when colonialism and apartheid ended. So can you just tell us about some of the experiences from those that you've interviewed?
Yeah, I interviewed over 50 families, starting in 2019, obviously for my PhD. Then I had the opportunity to carry on when I joined SWAP, which is Society Work and Politics Institute. And I used oral histories. And oral histories are really helpful in terms of highlighting people's historical backgrounds as well as changes over time. Like you'd ask questions like, where were you born? what was it like growing up, what was happening at the time. So you can also connect the past to the present when you do oral histories. So they take time, a lot of time, and that's why, you know, it has taken so long. Also back and forth where you go and study, you know, the interviews, and you go back to the families. And so I had asked them about the household relocations, how those were actually conducted, and did the mining company, for example, adhere to the law, but also asked about the exhumations, what they saw, and trying to assess whether the mining company had adhered to the law. And they described very gruesome experiences, like seeing ancestral remains, not being prepared for what they were going to see, because in as much as grave relocations have become common in South Africa, it's not a common experience for families. When they bury their loved one, they don't imagine that they'll see them again. And so, you know, they're seeing hip bones, all kinds of things, but some would have fossilized over time, so you find the soil. And then they also came to witness the reburials. And some actually explained how this was almost like a second death, you know, reliving the trauma and the experience as well.
Now, can you tell us the role that traditional leadership structures play in the politics of land and mining rights today?
It's so sensitive, and it's a question I've been grappling with. I'm still grappling with it, and I think I'll probably, you know, leave this world still grappling with it, as our government is grappling with it. Because traditional authority is in South Africa recognized by the Constitution. However, the Constitution doesn't articulate what role they actually ought to play. And so the Constitution is framed such that there will be legal frameworks developed over time that will articulate the role of traditional leaders. But obviously all the legislative frameworks that have been put in place somehow, you know, have not adhered to like democratic principles around consultation and so on. And so they've been scraped. And so then traditional leaders play a role, but they play a role by customary law. But customary law is not codified, so it's not written, right? And so that means there's some good in that, but there's also some downfalls in that, you know, like there's no point of reference. The point of reference is like leaving customary law, which actually works in some ways. Now in South Africa, it has just happened that in the former homelands where the apartheid government would forcefully remove people and place them in homelands, it just so happens that there's minerals in the, you know, the land that was barren, nobody cared about. It's like that's where we dump all the African people that we don't want, or where we'll draw our labor, you know, and so there were the reserves. So that's where the minerals are concentrated. And that's where the mining is going on, but that's also where traditional authority actually has powers, so they've got legitimacy in those areas. And so then it gets so complicated that when mining companies then come in, because of it's like a customary celebrated right or legitimacy, they then negotiate with the municipality and the Department of Minerals and Energy and traditional authority to relocate people and so on. So they play a critical role sort of in the local political economy in the former Bantustans, which happen to be minerally rich.
And with South Africa's ongoing energy crisis and the global push for a just energy transition, how do your findings speak to current debates about coal's future in South Africa?
My findings are basically articulating that there is a need for a shift towards a much cleaner system, because communities as it stands are sacrificed, right? So they're like what you term sacrifice zones, where people actually have to live uncomfortably, not have clean water, not have power, but they live next to these massive power stations that generate noise 24/7 for the rest of us to actually live comfortably. So there is a need for a cleaner energy system, but there's also a need to address the social inequalities, particularly in terms of accessing energy. So what others would call energy democracy, energy justice, and so on. Because as we're shifting, there's still people who don't have access to your coal power-centered electricity. And so what it speaks to is that we have to take the question around social justice seriously as we shift, because I've argued that you could have the same system replicate itself in a new energy system where people still don't have access, or where they're sacrificed once more, they're relocated for the building of windmills or wind power plants and so on. So this can replicate itself. So there's certain questions that we have to deal with in South Africa, like the land, questions around traditional authority, titling, ownership, and so on, as we shift.
And how do you see the legacy of colonialism and apartheid continuing to shape environmental justice movements today in South Africa?
There are strong legacies. I mean, if you think about it, there's now a growing discourse that's forcing us to go back to descale, to say we have to mine in ways that are sustainable, we have to interact with the land and the environment differently. And quite frankly, that's been articulated by communities, or what you'd call indigenous communities before. They were already doing that. The only difference is that it wasn't being articulated by people who actually hold power, or those that come perhaps from the north. And I think once people started realizing the urgency of climate change, then there's been also this realization that this will impact all of us, irrespective of race, gender, and so on. And so then there's been a push, but sometimes some level of cockiness to try and educate communities who've actually been interacting differently with the environment for centuries, and now wanting to teach them how to interact with the land. And you just see how those are traces of colonialism, where it says that local people don't have the relevant knowledge to interact with the land, and someone else has to articulate it. The learned people, for example, people from elsewhere. And only then it becomes like a matter of emergency. When it was always, I mean, if you interact with traditional healers, how they relate to the land, how they, for example, uproot a plant, it's in ways that actually allows them to replant, to go back to that soil. So yeah, you can see those traces of coloniality in the discourse, and also in interactions with local people, but now pushing to say, let's go back to the old ways when they've been there anyway.
And lastly, what do you hope readers take away from your book?
Look, I hope it casts light for what has happened to communities, because this has happened out of sight. Nobody knows that there's unmarked graves in Somkhele and elsewhere across South Africa, that on a daily someone is trying to look for their father's or their mother's ancestral grave, and that they are actually having psychological, emotional, spiritual problems as a result, and how that influences their daily experience of life. People will think, I'm not having children because I don't know where my grandmother's grave is, I'm not getting a job. Someone else will articulate that differently to say, no, it's because of the economy and so on, and recession or whatever. But there's people who approach this from a spiritual realm. And so I'm hoping that it casts light about how capitalism actually operates, and what are the gives and takes of having that system, and that maybe we have to think differently, think about the alternatives of life, way of interacting with the land. But lastly, I also hope that it really brings to the fore why land is important in South Africa, because there's been this discourse where people often say, but why do you need the land back? I mean, if we give you jobs, you should be fine, right? And I'm trying to articulate here that the land is what gives you dignity, because that's how citizenship was stripped off from Africans during apartheid, during colonialism. And so if you return the land, it symbolically but also does something to someone's identity, heritage, and being, so that they feel like they belong, they've got a home. And so I hope that it actually eradicates that question over time. and we see the importance of returning the land and dealing with the land question in South Africa.
That was with senior researcher Dineo Skosana discussing her latest book, No Last Place to Rest.